So far in this series, we've looked at how deep learning was a paradigm shift in AI, where intelligence is understood to be the ability to learn instead of following human instructions. The problem is, most people see neural networks as some kind of magic. It's not clear why they work. And so in this video, we'll explore the guts of a neural network. Recall that a neural network receives an input, which we could call a perception. This could represent an image, sound, text, anything we want a network to perceive. A perception boils down to a list of measurements that are provided as input as a list or vector of values. For example, if it was an image, each value would represent a single pixel's value in that image. And these values are represented as electrical pulses, which are sent to the first layer of neurons, which we call the input layer. And based on these values, some of the neurons in this layer will fire in a predictable manner and send off a pulse to the next layer of neurons, and this process repeats, creating a wave of electrical activity that passes through all the layers in the network. At the final output layer, certain neurons turn on or off. The output can describe the degree of belief that the input is or isn't some concept it's been trained to recognize, based on the activation level of the output neurons. A key question is, how does a neural network connect perceptions to concepts? Put another way, if we freeze a neural network as it's processing the picture of a dog, what is it doing inside right before it knows it's a dog? Let's start with the simplest possible neural network, a single neuron with just one input and one output. You can think of a neuron as a switch. The input is represented as a number, which is the value of something being measured, such as the temperature outside. If the input value is above a certain threshold, what we call the activation threshold, it flips the output on, otherwise the output remains off. And to better understand the guts of a neural network, we'll need a mathematical model of this simple switching action. Imagine the input value or temperature is a point on a line. The position of this point depends on the input value. We can think of this as our perception space. It's one-dimensional because we only have one input. A neuron can be viewed as dividing the perception space into active or inactive regions. If the value is above the neuron's activation threshold, it fires down the output. And so when we train a neuron, we are moving this dividing line around by changing the weight of the incoming connection, which determines how much current is needed to trigger the neuron. Similar to a thermostat, where the input is the temperature and the activation point is where we'd like the air conditioning to turn on. So let's consider a neuron with two inputs. Perhaps the input is a temperature and pressure reading of the environment. Now our model will have two variables which can each define a position along a dimension. And so together they can be thought of as a two-dimensional perception space or plane, where every input to the neuron is a point in this 2D space. In this case, the neuron can be represented as a straight line which partitions the space into active and non-active regions. Any input on this side will trigger the neuron, and any input on this side will not. And this pattern continues if we add more inputs. We just move up a dimension. Each measurement or input can be represented as a point in three-dimensional perception space. And the neuron can be represented as a plane which partitions this space into active and non-active regions. Perhaps we want the neuron to act as a storm detector, for example. And so no matter how many inputs it has, a neuron is like a partition or linear separation of a set of data points in perception space. In higher dimensions, we just call it a hyperplane. This is how perceptions, which are values measuring the environment, can turn into concepts, where a concept is a region in perception space. That's how the neuron knows how to feel a storm if a measurement is in the right region. But of course, reality is not always so simple because we can't always draw a straight line through our problems. For example, imagine a situation where we have two kinds of input measurements, temperature and humidity. And our input measurements arrange themselves in a perception space like this. The circles represent measurements of winter days, and the X's represent summer days, Well, we can't draw a single line to separate these points, but if we have two lines, we can, separating the data into 4 distinct regions. Each region is defined by the state of the neurons being on or off. If neuron 1 is on and neuron 2 is off, we know it's in this blue region. And that is why we need to use multiple neurons, so we have the ability to carve up the perception space into many more regions. And this is what the learning process does. By changing the weights of the connections, we move these partitions around to carve out regions around conceptually similar input points. So let's pause and summarize. A perception is a list of measurements that are inputted into a network. These vectors can represent a coordinate or point in perception space. The number of dimensions in this space is equal to the number of different input values. And neurons act as partitions in this space. And a group of neurons together define a specific region in this space. And these regions can carve out inputs which are part of the same concept. But so far we've been looking at simple toy problems, and when we move to the real world, things get a little bit more interesting. For example, the first big commercial application of neural networks was vision, specifically making a machine which can understand human handwriting, so that at the post office they can read human letter addresses automatically. This is a hard problem because everyone writes numbers slightly differently, so the machine must find the general pattern of each number. In this example, the input to our network is an image containing 784 individual pixels. And so we have 784 input dimensions, each which measure the brightness of 1 pixel. Using our spatial view, we can think of the image of each written digit we input to the network as a point in perception space. And if we take many real examples and plot them in the perception space, we get this. The points are not nicely clustered into regions, but scattered all over. And so to carve up this space into regions is going to be very difficult. The messy distribution of inputs in perception space is why shallow networks with only one middle layer struggle to divide categories up cleanly. The way out of this problem, though, is to follow the way of nature. Organic brains use layers of neuron activations to process their inputs. The importance of depth, or many layers, is the least understood aspect of neural networks. So let's pause and consider a simple analogy to understand why multi-layered networks are better at partitioning the perception space than a single-layer network. Imagine this is our perception space and we have 2 kinds of input data types. Each neuron we add in the first layer acts like a fold in this space. With 2 neurons, we can make 2 folds like this. And we could keep going, folding and unfolding the paper to carve out regions to separate these points. This will take 6 separate folds. This allows us to then group regions containing the same type of points using a final neuron which activates if any of those regions are active. But now consider what happens if we layer our folds. That is, we don't unfold after each fold. So let's do the first fold again, then the second, then the third fold across that layer like this. That ends up carving the space in the exact same way, using 3 folds instead of 6. And if we were to continue this process with a 4th fold, it results in 16 regions. And 5 folds results in 32 regions. This recursive power of folding shows how we can get exponentially more partitions using the same number of neurons if we layer them. Practically, this means that neurons deep in a network are not simple linear partitions, but are instead activated by a complex pattern of linear partitions. And so let's look at how this works using a real-world example. Researchers took a neural network which was trained on real images, such as ImageNet, and then probed individual neurons to find out what activated them or what turned them on. If we probe neurons in the first layer of the network, we find they are detecting these patterns, which are looking for edges and points. Then they move to the next layer deeper into the network and probe those neurons to see what activates them. What they found was the next layers are activated by different kinds of textures. And deeper into the network, these textures get more specific. And as you move deeper into the network, the textures get more complex. And the deepest layers contain individual neurons that are activated by entire objects, such as dogs, wheels, houses, or trees. These complex activation patterns are possible due to the layered structure of the network. And so if we cut open a neural network, we'll find the deep layers contain representations of a perception based on what level of different things or patterns they contain, which is defined by how active those specific neurons are. For example, an image of a dog would light up the dog-like patterns in the network. Finally, let's flip back to the spatial perspective to see this power of layers in action. Recall that our input, such as an image, can be represented by a point in perception space. And each of the following layer activations can be thought as moving that point to a new location. And it finally settles into a final space at the end of the network we could call concept space. And critically, the job of these transformations is to pull apart dissimilar points in concept space and push together similar ones. To see this in action, let's return to our real example, where we plot the points of various perceptions of different human-written digits. Notice at first, the points are scattered all over. But as these perceptions move through the network, gradually these points are separated into tighter and tighter clusters. And so each layer acts as a transformation that gradually disentangles these points. This allows the final layer of neurons to easily partition the data into separable regions, which represents the concepts, in this case numbers, we are looking to classify. And so the magic or true power of a neural network is entirely in this layered processing, because it allows the final layer of neurons to carve up concept space, where the points are nicely clustered, instead of perception space, which is hard or impossible to partition. That's how a neural network knows something is a number 3 or 6, based on the proximity to the 3 or 6 cluster. This partly describes why we have different mental feelings or intuitions when we see different objects. It's because different groups of neurons are being activated deep in our mind, depending on what cluster it belongs to. And these clusters can also be thought of as connected regions or manifolds. And so perceptions representing the written digit 6 would fall on one manifold, and the digit 3 would fall on another. And so manifolds are spatial regions which represent the patterns essential to a concept. These patterns are defined by the connection patterns or strength across the neuron layers. But so far we have only modeled how intuition works, that is, a rapid interpretation of some impulse, such as when you recognize someone's voice by a single syllable. This is what a single pass through a neural network simulates. The other big challenge is problems which require reasoning. Interactive problems, such as having a conversation or playing a game. These problems are sequential in nature and require things like a form of working memory. This leads us to the cutting edge of neural network research. How will a neural network learn to reason?